Everybody thought this wedding couldn't go on because he was dead. The bride, however, insisted that she would get married as planned, even without him there. 12 hours later, Mara Thompson, now Mara Kenwith, married the love of her life. It seems it didn't matter, her first love was dead. I'm Detective Cassandra Maddox. I expose the truths others would rather keep buried. And sometimes the truth doesn't arrive with grief. Sometimes it arrives with a wedding. On the night before Mara was set to marry her fiancé, Max Kenwith, he vanished. By the time the rehearsal dinner was meant to begin, no one could say where he'd gone. With every passing minute, the same question moved quietly through the room. Where was the groom? As you might guess, the dinner didn't go as planned, but not for the reason anyone expected. The Kenwiths and Thompsons carried a history of grudges deep enough to leave scars, fueled by business, pride, and a decade-old accusation that a Kenwith had murdered a Thompson. So when Mara's brother Jason rose to toast the happy couple, his words weren't exactly celebratory. He pointed a thumb toward the empty seat where Max should have been. Mara's father had handed the company the fortune, the whole family's future. Not to Jason, his own son, but to Max. And Jason's voice, thick with resentment, left no doubt he hadn't forgiven it. Towards the end of his speech, he mentioned how some of them weren't going to get through this night untouched. The warning was subtle, but there, woven between the anger and bitterness. By the time the rehearsal dinner finally ended, Max Kenwith was still nowhere to be seen. Close to midnight, shouting erupted in the hallway outside the bride's suite. Jason had cornered Max's brother, Sean, after learning that Max was still missing. Tempers flared quickly, and then Jason said something that made people stop pretending this was just pre-wedding stress. He threatened to finish what his great-grandfather started years ago. Said the Kenwith men never learned when to stop. That if Max didn't show, he'd make sure there were no Kenwiths left to look for. The fight was broken up, but the words and wounds lingered, heavy and unmistakable. The next morning, Max was still missing. Even then, the bride, Mara, insisted that the day go on as planned. She seemed least concerned about Max's disappearance, stating that it was a habit of his to go no contact for a while before he had to do anything important. Mara prepared in silence. She moved with purpose, calm in a way that unsettled the people around her. Her hands didn't shake. She didn't cry. She didn't ask questions. If she felt fear, she kept it carefully contained. 1 hour before the ceremony, Mara's mother asked if she should have the guests sent home. She suggested they say Max had fallen seriously ill, that the wedding would need to be postponed. Mara didn't raise her voice. She didn't hesitate. She told her mother no. The wedding would go on. Soon after that, the music began, and Mara stepped into view. There was no pause at the doorway, no searching glance toward the entrance. She didn't look back, didn't scan the rows for familiar faces, didn't acknowledge the empty space waiting for her at the altar. She simply adjusted the veil on her shoulders and started forward. Guests watched in silence as she walked the length of the aisle unescorted, her bouquet steady in her hands. If anyone expected her to break, to falter, to turn around, to finally admit something was wrong, they were disappointed. When she got to the altar, she asked the music keep playing until Max arrived. 2 minutes went by, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15, 30, 45 minutes. Then, at last, Max Kenwith appeared at the end of the aisle. He was out of breath, cheeks flushed, suit slightly disheveled, eyes darting. Every step carried the weight of someone who had run too far, too fast, trying to arrive on time but failing entirely. Guests instinctively leaned forward, murmuring under their breath, unsure whether to be relieved or alarmed. Mara didn't flinch. She didn't look toward him. Max finally reached the altar, and for a moment, he seemed incapable of speaking. He swallowed, adjusted his tie, and gave a shaky nod to Mara. She returned it with the faintest curve of her lips, as if the last 24 hours, all the chaos, all the uncertainty, had never touched her. They exchanged their vows, expressed how much they loved each other. They cried, and went on to celebrate as if none of this seemed strange. I would later learn that there was another absence that didn't go unnoticed at the wedding. Mara's father, Nathaniel, had been missing for 2 days. Everybody thought this wedding couldn't go on without him. After all, he was Mara's first love, the man who had raised her, protected her, and once held the entire family's fortune in his hands. By the time the celebration ended, questions were already forming in quiet corners of the room. Max had arrived, yes, but the timing of his appearance was suspicious. 2 days unaccounted for, no explanation fully satisfying. Guests whispered among themselves, trying not to stare too hard at Mara's serene composure. Max was the obvious first suspect. He had been missing at the rehearsal dinner. He had no alibi. He had every opportunity to have done harm, or to be hiding something. But the Thompsons were far from a united front. Mara's brother Jason still seethed over the company being handed to Max instead of him, and her aunt Clara watched quietly from the sidelines, her dislike of Mara's father no secret. Years ago, she had accused him of causing the death of her own husband. She had never forgiven him. The next morning, just before Mara and Max were to leave for their honeymoon, police arrived at the Thompson estate. Max Kenwith was arrested on the spot. Nathaniel Thompson, Mara's father, had been found dead by the groundskeeper earlier that morning, deep in the forest surrounding the family home. The discovery was gruesome in its quiet finality. He had been strangled, and judging by the bruises on his ankles and feet, likely dragged into the woods. Jason barely contained his fury. The company had been taken from him, the family fortune handed to Max, and now the man he came to loathe most in his life was gone, before he could change his mind about handing the company to him, stripping Max of it. Mara's mother crumpled almost immediately. Her hands trembled, tears spilling unchecked, a quiet, ragged sob escaping before anyone could offer comfort. The house seemed to shrink around her grief. Mara, on the other hand, remained still. Her eyes didn't water. Her hands didn't shake. If she felt the weight of her father's death, she kept it carefully contained, a fragile calm that unnerved even those who had watched her for years. Max protested loudly as officers guided him toward the waiting squad car, yelling that he was innocent. Mara didn't move. She didn't follow. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she took a steadying breath, as if the chaos around her were simply another case to be handled. She was a lawyer, and in that moment, she made her choice. She would be Max's attorney. She informed the police calmly that she would represent him. The words hung in the air, leaving the room silent, the guests unsure how to process the bride defending the man who was just accused of killing her father. Max claimed that during the hours no one had seen him, he had been meeting someone, but refused to provide their name or any specifics about their meeting. He insisted it was nothing illegal, nothing dangerous, simply a personal matter that required discretion. No one could verify it. No witnesses, no records, no receipts. The time he spent unaccounted for coincided with both the rehearsal dinner and the hours leading up to the wedding. Even as he insisted on his innocence, the ambiguity of the meeting raised more questions than answers. Who was the woman? What had they discussed? And most chilling of all, could the encounter have intersected with the moment Nathaniel Thompson was killed? Once Max's timeline was documented, investigators began reconstructing the movements of everyone else in the Thompson household during the same window of time. Jason Thompson admitted he had been drinking heavily the night of the rehearsal dinner. He placed himself at the estate for most of the evening, but could not account for several hours after leaving the dinner early, and there were no witnesses who could confirm where he went next. Clara Thompson, Nathaniel's sister-in-law, claimed she had retired to her room early that night. Staff recalled seeing her leave the common areas, but no one could confirm that she remained there. Her whereabouts during the early morning hours, when Nathaniel was believed to have been killed, were unknown. Mara's timeline appeared the cleanest. She had been seen preparing for the wedding, interacting with staff, and remaining inside the main house. There were no gaps large enough to raise immediate suspicion. After 4 days in custody, Mara coerced Max to finally disclose where he had been during the hours he was unaccounted for. He admitted to meeting a woman off the estate grounds. She was a local dealer he had been introduced to weeks earlier. Max acknowledged purchasing a controlled substance and consuming it shortly after the exchange. He admitted to combining it with alcohol and attributed the decision to mounting pressure related to the wedding and the impending transfer of Nathaniel Thompson's company and financial authority. He stated the use was isolated, ill-considered, and driven by stress, not habit. Medical intake records supported his claim. His blood work upon arrest showed residual levels consistent with recent use and alcohol intoxication, which also led to prolonged unconsciousness. That alone did not absolve him. The autopsy report, finalized the day prior, confirmed that fibers consistent with Max's clothing were present on Nathaniel Thompson's body. The finding remained unexplained. What shifted the investigation was time-stamped location data. Once Max disclosed the meeting location, Mara and I requested a narrow review of traffic and private security cameras within a 3-mile radius of the area. One camera captured Max's vehicle entering the parking lot of a deteriorating roadside motel around 4 p.m. Another recorded the vehicle exiting the next day at 3 p.m. There were no corresponding vehicle movements placing Max near the Thompson estate during the window in which Nathaniel was killed. The fibers, while real, could not establish when or how contact occurred. The evidence no longer converged. It conflicted. On the 6th day, Max was released pending further investigation. With Max released, investigators returned to the evidence that had justified his arrest in the first place. The fibers were sent for secondary analysis. Their composition matched a commercially common blend used in men's formal wear. No unique markers, no indication of transfer force. The findings confirmed what defense experts had already argued. The fibers could have been deposited days earlier in any number of ordinary interactions. Attention shifted to the timeline surrounding the rehearsal dinner. Investigators examined the movements at the Thompson estate during the same window. Several staff members recalled hearing raised voices late that night. The accounts were inconsistent. Some placed the argument near the main house. Others believed it came from the rear grounds. No one could identify who was involved. No one reported seeing Nathaniel afterward. A maintenance worker reported that an exterior service gate had been opened and closed sometime before the rehearsal dinner. The gate was rarely used and not equipped with a camera. The lock showed no signs of forced entry. Search teams had already established that Nathaniel was killed near the edge of the forest, not at the residence. Drag marks suggested the body had been moved only a short distance. There were no indications of a prolonged struggle. Investigators noted that the person responsible likely knew the property well enough to navigate it in the dark. By the 10th day, the case had stalled. Max remained under suspicion in theory, but the evidence no longer supported detention. The working assumption shifted. If Max did not commit the murder, then his absence had been used by someone who understood exactly how it would look. While preparing her final motion, Mara requested a consolidated timeline, every statement, every phone record, every access log, organized by minute rather than by suspect. She was searching for reasonable doubt. Mara returned to the statements given in the first 48 hours before the cause of death had been publicly released. In the days following Nathaniel Thompson's murder, and before the autopsy results were finalized, family members were asked routine questions: when they had last seen him, whether his absence concerned them, why no one had gone looking sooner. Lindsay Thompson's interview stood out for its composure. She explained that Nathaniel often took long walks on the property, that he valued solitude, that his absence, while unusual, was not alarming enough to disrupt the wedding preparations. At the conclusion of the interview, as officers gathered their notes, Lindsay added one final statement. She asked them to please find whoever strangled her husband. No one corrected her. No one questioned it. At that point, Nathaniel Thompson's cause of death had not been released. The autopsy was still pending. The manner of death had not been disclosed to the family. The statement was logged and forgotten until Mara requested the witness reports again. The timestamp on Lindsay's interview preceded the medical examiner's findings by nearly 24 hours. Mara cross-referenced every briefing, every internal memo, every disclosure. There was no record, formal or informal, of the cause of death being shared before the autopsy was completed. From there, the rest aligned without resistance. Mara requested one final interview. She did not accuse her mother. She asked when Lindsay had first learned how Nathaniel died. She couldn't answer. At the insight of her own daughter, it was discovered that Lindsay Thompson killed her husband after he transferred control of the family company and finances to Max, cutting her out entirely. She strangled Nathaniel on the estate grounds after quietly confronting him. She moved his body a short distance into the forest, using a service gate she was familiar with, and relied on Max's absence that night as cover. The fibers that implicated Max were incidental, not part of the murder. Her narrative remained composed and consistent, but her fatal slip, mentioning the manner of death before it was public, exposed her. Lindsay was eventually sentenced to life in prison. In the end, it happened to be those closest to Nathaniel Thompson that both caused and exposed his murder. If you're still here, you're one of the curious ones. Stick around. The next mystery's already waiting.